Yes.
Behind you. Oh, yeah, that's part of the reason we did not have that for general students. It's a little firmer at that end. But I'm Oh, I love people are waving. So most of you, I think, have found the refreshments, but feel free to help yourselves. We have there's beer, there's soda and seltzer, there's coffee and tea in the back, and whatever's on that table. We are delighted to have you join us. I knew I was going to have trouble figuring out where to stand. Okay, I just don't want to be right in front of you. Okay. Sorry, this is a big deal just because of all the connections that came through for today. I am the Reverend Stacey Allen. I am the chaplain here at Brent House. We are the Episcopal Campus Ministry associated with the University of Chicago, and we are delighted to host this event today. Sometime last year, so Nina was active at Brent House when she was here in my very first years here at Brent House. You came in 2004, and I started in 2005. So Nina has been part of my journey here as our chaplain for a long, long time. And about a year ago, I get this book in the mail from her. This is not going to make me look good, but I got this book from her called My First 30 Years, and I looked at it and I thought, okay, that's interesting. I didn't know why she was sending me a book. I went and read the book. I don't know why she sent it to me. Of this book, and then I realized why she had sent it to me. One of the questions that, as we were preparing for today's event, that Nina asked me was why we, as a Christian religious organization on campus, would host an event about Gertrude Beasley and banned books. And it was a hard question to answer because it seemed so logical to me that we would be a place that would allow or encourage the telling of full human stories. Any of you who've read My First 30 Years, and I highly recommend doing it, will know that Gertrude is a complicated person. She tells a story. She may or may not be an unreliable narrator. She goes through a lot of suffering. She says and does things that might be uncomplicated. None of us are unproblematic in various moments. And so of course, we would have this kind of conversation. I want us to jump quickly, though, to our presentation. So I'm going to introduce our speakers today. We have Nina Bennett, class of 2007. Who is, are you president? Publisher. Source. And we have some of the books on the buffet here, which we will explain why these books in particular in a moment. And I'm going to let you all, you are the ones who lived it. So the first question we had was, who is Gertrude Beasley and why should we care? Oh, I'm sorry, just because this is an essential question. If anyone needs to use the bathroom, it's right there in the kitchen, first door on your right. Now, who's Gertrude Beasley?
Hi, y'all. I'm really glad that you've come and joined us to talk both about the from the University of Chicago in 2018. She got her master's in education here.
Not 19.
1918. I promise this is not an adult beverage. In 1918, she's important for, I think, 4 reasons. One is her own personal story. So she was a trailblazer, this incredible rags to riches story, Scandal of Texas, dirt poor family, got her hands on education, really pulled herself up from no elementary school, let alone go on further, came to Chicago, taught at Chicago public schools, became a feminist, a suffragette, joined in organizing the women's movement, became a socialist, got very into Margaret Sanger and her early birth control movement, became a foreign correspondent, ended up living in Asia, Japan, in Russia during the revolution, and ended up in Europe, where she wrote her memoirs, which were published by the same Paris-based publisher who was publishing Gertrude Stein and Ernest Hemingway. And it, to all appearances, was this incredible story of upward momentum and gumption and grit. So that's part of why she's really interesting and moving. The second reason is her own life trajectory really debunked a lot of American myths that we held to strongly then and we continue to hold strongly to now. Her book came out at a time when this is after World War I, where we were very much trying as a country to re-find a sense of major key as a society. So at the same, a few years before Laura Ingalls Wilder published her children's books about frontier living, she was basically like, you know, it's actually pretty horrible to be a woman and to be poor. And it's pretty horrible to be a child who survives sexual trauma. And this sort of stuff affects you for the rest of your life. And it's pretty horrible to be a woman who is intellectually ambitious. And this is hard. Like all of these things that nice women didn't talk about, she spoke about very eloquently and very forcefully. So debunking all of these myths that frankly we continue to struggle with over the course of the 20th century. The third reason that she's really interesting is she was erased. You have never heard of her book, or you were unlikely to have heard of her book until Dominique republished it for Banned Books Week last September. And that's because almost all of the copies that were originally published were seized by customs. They were yanked off bookshelves by law enforcement. The copies that made it into universities, the book salesman who placed them there was someone in front of state legislatures to account for their un-American activities. So the book itself was erased pretty thoroughly. She was involuntarily committed to a psychiatric ward shortly within 10 days of coming back to the United States. And she never left that psychiatric ward. She died there 23 years later at the age of 55 and was buried in an unmarked grave with nothing but a number. So really, she could not have been erased more thoroughly. This young woman with such a promising upward trajectory and so much talent and such a inconvenient story to tell. So that's the third reason. I'd say the fourth reason that her story is really interesting is what it has taken and what it has looked like to bring her back into civic conversation. This has been a work of a lot of love over the past 30 to 40 years of various people independently of each other, stumbling across her writing, being unable to let go of her really powerful prose, and doing whatever they could within their own power to elevate her. So there was Larry McMurtry, who wrote all the famous demythologizing cowboy, Lonesome Dove, etc. in the 80s. He thought she was the best memoirist, the best writer of her era. And so he pulled strings with his own contacts to have her book republished in an admittedly very high price point, limited issuance in the late 1980s. You had a wonderful librarian in Abilene who got really excited about this and used her librarian superpowers to track down everything that she could, including newspaper articles that were published, a letter that Gertrude wrote from the ship coming back to the United States to the Department of State, where she said that various people were trying to have her killed or imprisoned. Is that so bizarre when it turned out she was then imprisoned 10 days later? This same librarian, with some help of other people who got involved, when the census digitized its records, its 1930 census records, they discovered that there was a Beasley in this psychiatric ward on Long Island. And through one thing led to another, were able to confirm that it was her. connected with her family, got a gravestone installed, a whole bunch of different elements coming together. I personally discovered the book when my husband and I moved to Texas right before COVID happened. And I was very intrigued by the complexity of Texan identity and Texan literature and wanted to understand the different flavors and background there, and picked up a Norton anthology of Texas literature because I am and always will be a UChicago nerd. And was working my way through that, and a literature professor from UT Austin happened to include the first 10 pages of Gertrude's memoir, and my hair stood on end. I was just like, what is this, and where can I find more? Turns out that you couldn't find more because her book wasn't available. It was nowhere. It was really nowhere to be found. I managed to get my hands on a copy, and was recounting this story to Dominique, and it turns out that this whole saga is so in line with everything that we're seeing today about women and marginalized voices and access to stories that are inconvenient and can be distasteful. And all of these different efforts that Source Books, which is a feminist Chicago-based publishing company, believes really strongly in. So we kind of got together as a family. My sister-in-law Marie helped transform the book and digitize it. And by gum, it is out. It is available almost 100 years after it was originally published and banned. So I think that Gertrude, as an alumnus, her story and what it says about women and the 20th century, and what it says about books and stories today, all of which I think is very important.
Dominique, so we can continue the timeline. Nina came to you and said, look at this book. What was the process for deciding to publish it?
Well, okay, just a couple of things about Source Books. We are the 8th largest publisher in America. We were founded in a bedroom, and we are indeed a feminist press. We are a feminist commercial press, which is and by the way, my daughter Marie was employee number one. Today, we have regularly 2 or 3 books on the list. There are a bunch of them on today, week, and we have about 200 employees. So we are the largest publisher in Chicago by quite a lot, which is a bit bizarre because if you look at the rest of the list of large publishers, they're all headquartered in New York City, which is where you think publishing belongs, right? So what has been interesting for us for Source Books as a journey is in fact the uplifting and the development and the making available of outsider voices. That's fundamentally the mission. If you go on our website, you'll see Books Change Lives, and that's basically what we're about. Which is why those books over there and a whole lot of other books are amongst the most banned books in America. We just, that's part of our approach. I thought this book was particularly interesting for all of the reasons that Nina said, because the silencing of women's voices is in fact one of the great tragedies of our age. It's one of the great tragedies of our nation, but it's not just the silencing of women's voices, it's the silencing of all outsider voices, right? We are a nation that refuses to tell our own history. And we need to do that in a far more robust way. So this is a part of our history that I thought was really interesting to tell. I mean, the point that Nina makes so eloquently is that the vision that you have of Laura Ingalls Wilder's Prairie is not actually history as the people who lived it, right? That history is actually probably far more like Gertrude Beasley's story It is far more traumatizing. It is far more difficult. It is far more challenging in very real ways.
And the struggles that she was able to articulate without having the same vocabulary that we have today to identify that feeling of otherness was palpable. So she talked about coming from an underprivileged socioeconomic background, coming from dirt poverty, and coming into this elite university campus and feeling like a total outside and feeling a lot of shame. She has a great quote that maybe in a second I'll pull up on my phone, where she says, walking onto campus, that she felt this incredible mix of ambition and empowerment and vitality and deep shame and struggle with that, all wrapped up together. And that resonates a lot on the complexities that, particularly undergrads who are still becoming themselves, really struggle with when they come away from home. So she talked about how this was the first time that she had walked into a room and the men all stood up and someone pulled their chair out for her, and she's like, I don't know what to do. There was a big back and forth about her being from Texas here in Chicago, both from her acquaintances back in Texas. There's a quote about, going to Chicago is akin to going to hell. And from her acquaintances here in Hyde Park, where she was nicknamed Lyncher because of all of the terrible things going on in the South at the time. And she felt defensive of her geographic background. So she felt that she had to defend all the terrible racialized things that people in Chicago thought of people from the South, very much putting her in this sort of regional tension. It exposed her to whole new dynamics about what should a lady sound like. And to her credit, she took one look at that and she's like, no, not going to do that. So she became one of the favorite gadflies of the Chicago public school system, apparently also of her teachers. She loved to tell people why they were completely wrong, and she would do so apparently while pounding on the table. So she brought a lot of strength with her, and I could imagine being in the classroom with her, or being a student teacher with her. You might never guess how much of a shell, like how much of a hard shell she had to carry just to make it through every single day. There's a scene when she graduates from UChicago and her mom comes up and she's so ashamed. She doesn't want any of her Hyde Park acquaintances to meet her mom because she doesn't want them to hear her mom's accent. And just navigating all this was really hard. So I think to me, there's a piece here about whether or not folks who come to this campus who have not traditionally been part of the socioeconomic strata welcome on this campus, the extent to which they feel that they have a place here too. And here was a young woman. By gum, she made it through. She did so. There's the Regenstein has a copy of her master's thesis, as well as a piece that she published in a peer-reviewed journal while she was here. So she clearly did well, but it was hard on her. And when you read the book, you can tell just how hard it was in a way that you probably couldn't have if you had been next to her in real life.
Free expression. None of us are going to agree on it. Even in this room, we won't agree. Never mind out there. We're not going to agree on what it means, how we live it, how we communicate it to students. We're not going to agree. The question is, what do you do when you disagree? What do you do with that? I'm part of an industry that is not yet where it needs to be nowhere near, in fact, where it needs to be with respect to diversity and inclusion. By the way, I'm part of a larger industry, the media, which is even further behind. I would say book publishing or the book industry is perhaps a little bit ahead of the rest of the media, but we are all struggling with this, and we need to do a hell of a lot better. Storytelling is at the root of how we communicate with one another. It is fundamental to us as a species, and we need to include everybody's stories. And I mean everybody's stories. And that's going to require some things. That's going to require a lot of things. I published the 9th most banned book in the country. I've been publishing it for 15 years, I think. This book is gay. It is stolen it is the most stolen book in high school libraries.
What's it called?
This book is gay.
Oh, okay.
Now I'm going to tell you some things about this book that I found really interesting. It is stolen because kids don't want to be seen reading it. They're terrified of that. It is stolen because they don't want to check it out. It's stolen because they don't want other people to know they have it. It's been used in some really interesting ways. We do a fair amount of advertising against this book. If you read the ads, what people put into our ads, the comments they put, it's absolutely fascinating. Kids will tell you they've used this book to tell their parents they were gay. They left it on the coffee table. It is an extraordinary book. We have to do more of that. All of us. And by the way, when I say publishing, I don't mean publishing. I mean the whole book community. When I think of the book community, I think of authors, I think of publishers, I think of my colleagues who are in book selling, and I think of readers. It is a complete ecosystem, and it is going to require all of us in order to have both a more robust conversation around how we deal with free expression when we don't agree, and how we allow for us to have a conversation about the things that are so deeply personal, so incredibly meaningful to us, like this book, when we simply disagree with one another.
We didn't talk about this question, but I'm going to ask it. Have you had occasion where you had to decide about whether to publish a book, where you wondered whether you should and you did anyway?
Absolutely. We're a feminist press. We don't make any bones about it, and you can look at what we publish, guys. It's not we don't hide it. So we're there are going to be books that people look at and don't like on my list. Really don't like on my list.
Are there books that you don't like on your list?
There was one, and I got rid of it. It was actually brought to my attention that it contained, I had never read the book, so I admit to that. I had not read it.
435 books a year. Yeah.
I had not read it. We bought it as part of an acquisition. We buy a fair number of companies, and we bought it as part of an acquisition. And a number of our employees came and said, "Is this okay?" And I looked at it and I said, "No, it's not." And we got rid of it.
What was the book?
I honestly don't remember. It was.
You banned it from your mind.
Well, look, let's talk about book banning and what it means, okay? So book banning is not when a publisher chooses to not publish a book, because that is a decision I make every day. There is no day that goes by when I don't decide I will not be publishing this book. Okay, that is a 365 days a week experience. Okay, days a year. I'm sorry.
Long weeks.
Yeah, long weeks, yeah. Days a year experience. I mean, I do that every day. Every publisher does that every day because that's actually what the job is. So that isn't book banning. Book banning is when let's pick a couple of examples that have happened recently. So last month, the state of Georgia put the power of book review and approval away from trained professionals and into the hands of school boards. They took a whole bunch of books off shelf in Georgia. Last year, an all-white school board banned a list of books about people of color. Students in that district are now forbidden to read books about Rosa Parks or even to watch Sesame Street's town hall on racism. That is what book banning looks like. A few weeks ago, a school district in Florida banned a picture book called Everywhere Babies. It is a board book, by the way, that celebrates the love we share as human beings for the little babies in our lives. Some of the illustrations had, just so you know, content that was deemed pornographic. Pornographic means what? It had loving adults, two loving adults of the same sex. Now, those two loving adults, you were never told whether they could be siblings, couples, friends. You didn't actually know, but they got rid of that book. That's what book banning looks like.
That was my next question. Are we ready to take some questions? Stand up so we can see folks. Do you have questions? Yes.
Can you tell us a bit about why her book was banned?
Oh, yes.
You just have to read like
The
10
first
pages.
paragraph.
Like,
The
really,
first paragraph.
honestly, you'll get it right away.
Actually, if I may, I would love to read just the first sentence because it's so powerful. And again, remember, this was published in 1925. 30 years ago, I lay in the womb of a woman conceived in a sexual act of rape, being carried during the prenatal period by an unwilling and rebellious mother, finally bursting from the womb only to be tormented in a family whose members I despised or pitied, and brought into association with people whom I never should have chosen. Sometimes I wish that as I lay in the womb, a soft pink embryo, I had somehow thought, breathed, or moved and wrought destruction to the woman who bore me, and her 8 miserable children who preceded me, and the 4 round-faced mediocrities who came after me, and her husband, a monstrously cruel, Christ-like, and handsome man with an animal's appetite for begetting children. It is perfectly clear to me that life is not worth living, but it is also equally clear that life is worth talking about. So
Any question about why the book was banned?
That's dramatic, but why was it banned?
Yes.
Why was the book banned?
yes, no. So there were a number of different reasons, and it was banned with greatest ferocity in Texas, where she was from. Part of it is because it's a nonfiction. So she was naming names and telling about very real relationships in Abilene. One of those, like the traitest answer to give you is that in one of her anecdotes, there's this matron who is clearly up in Abilene society who may or may not be having an inappropriate relationship with the local Baptist pastor. Turns out that matron later became mother-in-law to the governor of Texas. So the governor of Texas really had it out for this book and wanted it nowhere available. That's the trite reason. The reason why Scotland Yard was out after this book and why U.S. Customs was out after this book, and she ultimately got deported from the UK because of this book, was because of its frank talk about sexuality and sexual consent. It's frank talk about how birth control would have changed her mother's life, that part of the reason why her mother had such a harrowing life and remained sentenced to a life of poverty was because she neither had access to birth control nor access to sex education, and that there was no culture around. I'm at this point using my words, not hers. There was no culture around consent, sex positivity, a woman's desire to participate, and Gertrude felt very strongly. These were a lot of topics that were circulating in Chicago at the time, because you had Margaret Sanger from Planned Parenthood coming and giving talks about birth control. You had the suffragettes that were talking about women's empowerment. And there was Freud, who was becoming very popular on campus, and sort of the relationship between sex and psychology. And Gertrude had a pretty strong point of view about the relevance of all of that, not just on campus and in elite circles and for wealthy women like Margaret Sanger, but also the profound relevance for sort of everyday Americans like her own family. And this was at the time when the Comstock law meant that you couldn't have any discussion of birth control being sent through the mails. Margaret Sanger was herself arrested and incarcerated for sending out pamphlets about birth control. So that's possibly the easiest national and international reason why the book was banned.
Can you give us any information on, was there an incident or something that happened which preceded her being committed to an institution? And was there a diagnosis made which would support her being committed to an institution, rather than some civil action that she wrote something that was pornographic? That would take you to a court, but not necessarily to a mental institution.
That's a
Where she
great
never
question.
got out.
That's a great question. So there's limits to what we know. What we know is that her publisher was in Paris and she was living in London. At some point, the publishers mailed her proofs of her book, and Customs opened up the package, read, I guess, the opening line, their hair stood on end, and enough of this got around that there was even some articles in British press at the time saying, this Miss Beasley is publishing a pornographic book about, her childhood in Texas. This has to be stopped. And they weren't able to stop it at the time because the publisher wasn't in the UK. The book was in the UK. The publisher was not in the UK. This was the Scotland Yard that was looking into all this. The book's then published. It's then distributed. Copies are seized as fast as they possibly can be. At this point, Scotland Yard upped their game to try to get her out of the country. There was an incident. We don't know exactly what happened, but it was in, I want to say 1927. All we know is a member of the London police came. Either they came to arrest her, they came to evict her. It wasn't quite clear. She got angry. She's a woman who gets angry very eloquently. And she broke a window with an umbrella. And that was one step too far. Next thing you know, the London police have put her into a mental institution in London and told the American embassy that she is invited to leave the country swiftly. So she was deported. She was put on by the American embassy on a ship to go to New York. It's not clear what the terms were. There is the surviving letter that I mentioned earlier of that she penned to send to the Department of State. It's very rambly. She could absolutely have been going through a mental break. I kind of would have in her shoes, in which she said that there were people that were out there to get her, challenging her life, challenging her career, particularly people in Texas. This got mailed off. And the only thing that we know afterwards that within 10 days, she was put into the Central Islip Psychiatric Ward and never left. Now, several people, including her her grandniece, the closest blood relative, have attempted to get copies of her medical records to find out why exactly, what was the justification for putting her in the psych ward, let alone for life, without any recourse. She had no correspondence, after she was put into the ward. And the state of New York has been unwilling to even confirm that they have any records left. So this is very much an ongoing mystery. We don't know why she was put away, and we don't know why she was kept away.
Nina, if I could just add one thing to this. You should be aware that the United States has a history of incarcerating or institutionalizing women that are difficult or troublesome. So this is, we published actually last year a book by Kate Moore about Elizabeth Packard, who's actually a Chicagoan. I don't know if anybody knows Elizabeth Packard's story, who was a fiercely independent and very smart, opinionated mother of 6, who her nature made her husband so angry. He had her nature made him so angry that he had her committed against her will to a horrific asylum. Her children were taken away from her, and she found herself among many other sane women, by the way, who had been put away. They were labeled deranged. They were ignored. Elizabeth fought hard for her own freedom for years, and in doing so, liberated generations of other women. The book, which is, by the way, right there, is The Woman They Could Not Silence, from Kate Moore. So this is actually a thing that we as Americans have had much experience with.
Other questions?
I'm also in publishing, so this is a little industry focused. We don't have to spend much time on this. I'm curious about the process of you bringing this book back into print, whether there was an editorial process, if there was some. Tell me about the tweaking. So I'm really curious about what kind of decision making after whether to publish or not was made, like the foreword, anything that you would like to touch on. I'm very curious about.
Would you like to come sit here to answer?
I suppose. I'm here.
So I was the tweaker, is that the right word?
Here,
I don't know
I
that's, I'm not sure that's the word. Yeah, so I actually got my editing certificate. I'm a professional musician by trade and by all my degrees, but I have my editing certificate from UChicago. And yeah, I remember hopping on we were family Zooming all the time during the pandemic. We live across the street from each other, so we were always seeing each other. But with my siblings, I got onto a Zoom call late and they're in the middle of and Marie can do the editing. I'm like, what now? What are we even talking about? And then that's when this whole, talking about the book and everything. So it's interesting, obviously being an editor of a deceased author, you can't ask questions. You can't make substantial changes to the book. So the first part of the job was taking, because Nina, you for what, a couple $100 somewhere, you finally managed to find a physical copy of this book, which we immediately took from you. She was on me to mail it back for months before I finally did. And so we got that scanned in and then I got the digitized scan, and this was the manuscript I was working with. But even, dumb little editorial things like in the scan, all the L's turned into the number 1. And I mean, so the first part was I went through the manuscript a couple times, just making it readable. And then from there, she uses a lot of slang. What's the word I'm actually looking for?
Slang's fine.
Slang is fine. Okay. But it wasn't consistent throughout the book. Like she would spell things differently. And so I think she means the same thing. It's used in the same context, but the spelling is slightly different. So, can we unify that some? And then also some of her paragraphs just will go on for pages and pages. Like I'm reading Melville. I mean, it's just like, I don't understand that either. But, so there was a lot of like, okay, we're going to just, can we put a paragraph in, start a new paragraph here and start a new sort of section in this. So it was just enough tweaking to make it readable, and again, to unify some of the spellings. There were some words that none of us knew. So look up those and say, oh, well, that actually is a word. I didn't know the name for that, obsolete piece of household kitchen utensil or something like that. So that was the main part that I had in it, was that. So.
What is an editorial certificate from the university?
Oh, so the Graham School has various certificate programs. So there's a certificate in editing. What are some of the other? Do you know? I don't. Yeah, look up the Graham School. There are various. So it was a handful of courses that you take. I think I took 6 different courses for the certificate. So.
What were some of the courses?
Basic editing, intermediate editing, followed by advanced editing. And then there was editing electronically, developmental editing for fiction, developmental editing for nonfiction. I think
It was
those were
interesting
the
marketing
ones.
a book by an author. It's always interesting marketing a book by an author who's dead. Because
the book tour is just.
I
more challenging.
Pretty expensive, actually.
It's a
So,
seance for everyone.
there you go. But I think we got a fair number of really good reviews, and people were interested in the story. The story itself is deeply compelling.
I've got a question. So if, from a publishing perspective, a book has been banned, what steps do you take? I mean, apart from shaking your fist and saying, fools, like, where do you go from there?
There's actually there's a
So glad you asked.
So as you don't directly leave after this, look for there in a couple places in these other rooms. There you go, a piece of paper with 2 QR codes.
Yep.
For Sourcebooks website, which you will tell us what those are.
Yes, so we've obviously been deeply engaged with this and with this conversation, and so you will find a piece of paper that looks kind of like that, and it has 2 QR codes. The first takes you over to the American Library Association's Unite Against Bans campaign, book bans campaign. There is a tremendous amount that can be done and that you should read about there. We've also got a whole set of the other one is a whole set of resources that we've put together, including different things to do every month. I mean, we're deeply engaged in this. So different things to do every month, and and all of the things that we can and should as citizens participate in. This is a national conversation we are having. It is an everyday conversation we are having. Last week, some would-be congressperson in Virginia, I think, decided to sue Barnes & Noble for having 2 books in their stores, for selling 2 books. Okay. This is an everyday conversation that is taking place across America, and we all need to engage and participate.
Yeah, I have 2 questions, one on the author and one on the publishing. Let's get to the simple one first. Was there a copyright issue with this book?
Nope, it's out of copyright.
So the book was not legally banned then, right? I mean, you don't go to prison for publishing a book. It's just banned in a practical sense, is that there were no copies and nobody was publishing it for decades, right? So you have to find an old copy, digitalize it, go through the whole.
It was banned at the time of publication.
Was it legally banned?
Yes, under the Comstock law.
Okay. But then that expires, something had that law went
Yes,
away.
the Comstock law is no longer
Yeah,
no longer the law of the land. Thank goodness.
Okay. Now, do we know anything about her last 23 years?
No, we know
No,
nothing.
No, nothing.
No writings, no communications,
She
no
was-
correspondence?
There's
no
nothing that came out of the psychiatric ward.
No medical records?
She died of pancreatic cancer.
We know that she died of pancreatic cancer because there was
That's it.
her death certificate. But again, the state of New York has not released any documentation about her last 23 years.
Do they have it?
They will not answer that question. We don't know the answer to that question.
The whole.
I
The problem is a legal one because certainly
Yes.
if they have the information, it's foilable, right?
They have cited HIPAA,
Medical privacy.
which, yes, I appreciate the irony of HIPAA being, yeah.
Much later on.
Oh, they
Yes.
actually invoke HIPAA for someone who's been dead that long without.
Anyone who's a lawyer who wants to pick up this cause,
Are there family members alive?
She has a great.
she has a great niece, and that was how they were able to get confirmation that it was Gertrude Beasley, and that's how they were able to get the death certificate. But even to the great niece, they will not release this information. There's a really wonderful modernist literature professor at Stony Brook University. Her name is Celia Marshak, and she published a book on modernist literature and book banning in the 1920s era. Really thoughtful book, really powerful, and that's how she first came across Gertrude, because you had all of these Puritan press folks that were agitating about Gertrude. She's like, who's this Gertrude person? And this was back in 2002, 2003. She got obsessed, like many of us do who discover the story, and because Stony Brook is just right down the street from where the Central Islip Psychiatric Center used to be located, she spent years trying to get access to the records. And ultimately, their final correspondence on the subject was where they quoted HIPAA to her. And she's like, I'm a lit professor. There's only so far that I can take this. So maybe that's the next person's job, picking up the baton.
It's a hand at the back.
You've answered some of this question already, but I know we're all focused at Chicago on primary sources, but other than what you've mentioned already, are there secondary sources about either focused on her and some sort of anthology, I sense, about writers or women of her era, either in Europe or here?
I'm so glad you asked, because I was suckered into writing the foreword mostly because at the time I was the person who geeked out the most about this and was Google stalking all of this. And I spent a lot of time on the internet trying to find what there had been lore and commentary, secondary articles published since the 1980s about who she was and what her impact was. But actually tracking down those primary sources was rather difficult. What does exist? So there's her writing itself for the period up until she left the United States to become a foreign correspondent, and there's great discussions about her life at University of Chicago, her life working as a teacher in the Chicago public school system, and then being a college instructor in Tacoma, Washington. Bellingham, thank you. So close. And so there's that. There's also newspaper articles that she published first in Chicago, but then also in the foreign court as a foreign correspondent. So she published in the Hearst newspapers, Margaret Sanger's Birth Control Review, and a couple others, and I do have access to a few different of those published articles. Now, when the whole book banning thing happened, Chicago Trib actually published an article about something like "local girl ends up in hot water" or something like that, and
She was only marginally local.
right? But it was a really good story. So.
Let's make it look.
And there was an article published in the Hearst papers about I was one of 13 white trash children. Here is my story, which was right around the time of publication. Another interesting thing that we have is the contemporaneous discussion of her book, because it was still circulating somewhat, even if clandestinely. So there was a great H.L. Mencken review, like 2.5 pages, and he was like, I've never read anything like this, basically. This was really saying how powerful this was as writing. And he really wanted to shake Gertrude Mother's hand, and that the writing was obscene but real in a way that they hadn't encountered for a poor Southern family. Remember, this was published a whole year before Faulkner published his first book, right? So this was really breaking new ground. So he came out with it. There was an article in the New Yorker that said that this was, daunting. Like this was, that there was a reason that this was not being published out of a American press. We have a letter that Hemingway wrote to Ezra Pound talking about the book, in which we don't have Ezra's letter to Hemingway, but based on Hemingway's response, Ezra really liked it. And he really liked that she was taking issue with American exceptionalism. And Hemingway's response was, yeah, but it's nonfiction. I mean, how good can it really be if it's nonfiction? Which, So, and we do have the letter that she wrote on that final boat trip. And then we have the death certificate, and we have the census, the 1930 census. But that's pretty much all we have. So there's a lot of trying to piece together. Oh, we do have Bertrand Russell, the Nobel award winner. She and he became friends when she was a foreign correspondent in Asia. And we have a copy of the letter published in Russell's memoirs, where she wrote him basically asking for help. The proofs of her book were off, and she was basically penniless. And she was like, I'm so hungry, I can't eat. I don't know what to do. I'm being harassed.
I'm sorry, at this point, she's not getting much correspondent work because.
Right, because she's in London. She's just finished writing this.
And newspapers like.
To the best of my knowledge, I don't know why that happened, but so she wrote to Bertrand Russell asking for his advice and probably asking for some money. So we have that letter that she wrote to him. We have no idea what if anything he wrote back. The commentary in his memoir is limited. It's one sentence, and it's basically like, Ms. Beasley wrote a memoir which is extremely truthful, which is illegal. Would have been nice if he'd then tried to figure out what happened to her and why she stopped writing to him for 23 years. But so that's what we know in terms of primary sources.
Thank you.
What was she writing about in China? Was it political? Was it dealing with the Chinese revolution? And if so, could that have had any influence on getting her in trouble?
Absolutely. So she was an avowed socialist, and she talks a lot about that very frankly in her memoirs. At the time, especially in the teens era before the Red Scare of 1919, socialism was actually a really attractive political alternative for poor farmers, particularly poor farmers in the Midwest and in the South. So there was a lot of discussion of those ideas. When she ended up abroad, I do know that she was first at I want to say it was the Ford Foundation had a college in China. I may be misnaming the foundation, and if so, I apologize. And she at first used that as an opportunity to do secretarial work, but then also to go throughout China and do reporting on what did it look like during that time period. What did the social change look like? She did some side trips into Korea, as well as into Vietnam and Thailand. She sourced photographs for the National Geographic. several of which, if you Google Gertrude Beasley, a bunch of photographs from 1920s East Asia will pop up. She didn't necessarily take them; she sourced them. And then she had very strong feelings about the Russian Revolution. So she actually managed. So it was barred for Americans. American passport holders were not allowed to go into Russia at the time. She went in through Serbia and finagled her way in, and actually writes the first several pages of this while sitting like facing the Kremlin, and has some not very polite company adjectives to give to the White Russians and what she thought of them at the time. So that's a long answer to your question of basically saying absolutely, because by the time this was published in 1925, political opinions in both the UK and the US had hardened about socialism in particular.
So she was published by a guy named Robert McCalman, who founded a company called Contact Editions, and he was actually Contact Publishing Company in 1923, and he was actually the first publisher of Hemingway. He published Hemingway's first book, which was 3 stories and 10 poems, and he also published Gertrude Stein's The Making of Americans. He published quite a lot of things before stopping publishing in around 1929.
He had a horrible quote, great but horrible quote in his memoirs, which were written in the late 30s, which is that I have worked for 2 megalomaniacs in my life who always wanted to have everything their own way. They were both Gertrudes, Stein and Beasley, which is basically clearly how he felt about uncompromising women.
Yeah. Yep.
So I want to be aware of time. It's about 5:30. I have one final question for Dominique to get us on our way. But you are, and then I will have just a couple of things to share. And once we finish, you are welcome to stay. There are plenty of refreshments and good company to share conversation with. So my last question for you, Dominique, is because of the way the commitment you have in this fight against banned books, what should we be going out ready to do? What
I think you've got to participate in local politics, and I know that's going to be just a pain for a lot of different people, and I apologize. But honestly, we've got to support our library. They're talking about putting librarians in jail, which is like, you have to just think about what that means, right?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Well, I mean, we're having a national conversation in which, well, it's actually a local conversation in which people are discussing putting librarians and educators in jail. I mean, it is insane what people are discussing right now. And it is pretty much every week. So if you see book banning, report it. There's on the ALA, the ALA has a reporting functionality. We urge you to participate there. We participate in 100 different ways, and you can see all of that and work. But I think working through your local school board, your local library board, working to support, your local politicians, we need to be very clear. Here's the thing that's really interesting to me, and I had meant to bring this up earlier. There are very few things, as far as I can tell, that Americans agree on these days, right? Can we all agree that we disagree? Right?
I think we all agree on.
We can all agree on that. Here's the thing that we mostly agree on. 67% of Americans, no matter what kind of American they might be, 67% of Americans are against book banning. That is the vast majority of us. 67% of us don't agree on a lot of things, right? But we agree on this. So I think we need to get just a whole lot louder about the things that we agree on, because we agree on this.
Would you tell the story about the naked roommate? Because that's a really good example. And all of the books here on this side table are books that you all have published that have been banned.
Well,
So
yeah.
There's our visual.
There are actually many more than this, but we brought these but I will tell you the story of the naked roommate because it's really bleak. This is of course Florida. On a Tuesday, sorry, I couldn't help myself. Texas and Florida.
I'm sorry, I'm from Texas. It's really nice to hear someone from Illinois making fun of a state other than mine. So go ahead.
So on a Tuesday night in the Sumter County, Florida school board meeting, the board approved the use of a book as a supplemental reading in a second semester senior elective health class. The book was The Naked Roommate. Now you need to know that The Naked Roommate is used for what is called it's that how do you prepare your child for college experience. So it's used, I mean, we've sold almost 500,000 books, so it's a lot of books. So a lot of people use this book. Okay. And it's been a supplemental resource for 6 years in this class as it addresses topics that students may experience post-high school, including sexuality, substance abuse, sexually transmitted infections, and many more. Thanks to Florida's House Bill 545, which was passed in June of 2001, materials related to sexual education must be made public for parents to review annually. It gives parents the right to opt their children out. Schools must also be in compliance with Florida State Statute 1006. This is more than you want to know, but which governs textbook and material acquisition and use in schools. So working to comply with the above brought the naked roommate before the board for parental consideration and input. Days before the meeting, a letter ran in the local paper, and it said to the editor, issues you might expect a confused college freshman to run into, such as budgeting, how to make new friends, how to handle credit cards, how to tackle dorm life. But those few examples hardly reach 107. What are some of the other examples? And you can imagine what this letter lists, right? The school board is set to vote on final approval of this book on January 18th, and she would like the board, the school, to teach my children science, math, and English, not these other things. Yeah, you guessed it. This book was indeed banned as curriculum in the school, in this particular school system. And that is actually what is going on across our nation right now. As locale by locale, people are having conversations around what is and is not appropriate. Now, here's the thing that's probably in some ways almost more frightening. Librarians and teachers are scared of being caught in this political conversation. It's a highly political conversation to be a party to, right? And as a result, books are disappearing from shelves across our nation, whether or not they're banned. Books on racism, books on sex, books that might or might not be about, choice, might or might not be about, sexual orientation, might or might not be about. There are lists and lists and lists of books, including in Texas, in which there was a list of 100, I think it was 150 books, of which we had like 20 some odd. So there are long lists of books that are being taken off shelf and being discussed by a vocal, and I want to say this again, a vocal, angry minority. This is the minority of our nation making this decision. We are the majority of the nation. It is up to us to get very loud.
Wow, I kind of want to end there, but it looks like we'll take one more question and I'll say my piece and we can move the
Well,
conversation.
I'm a retired librarian and.
Yes.
Ultimately, I worked in science and ethical and academic libraries. I did do a lot of work and remain interested in librarianship for children and young adults. And when I was studying to become a librarian in library school, not here, we studied a lot about issues with restricting books for children, not only banning, but other issues you might do. But there was some interest on doing this from the left too. There was a group whose name I had forgotten. I've been trying to think of it. And I can remember when I was doing my project on this, they were concerned, for example, that one children's book that had policemen beating people didn't include any women policemen beating the people. They wanted, yeah, I'm serious. They
She's
wanted the atrocities to be handled equally by males and females and not just by males. So my question is, do you think this was the late 70s? And I do read about it, but now but not very frequently. I mean, I read incidents. Do you think what's happening now is significantly worse than in preceding decades and in relating to the political climate? I mean, I don't go back long enough to know how it was under McCarthy, but between then and recent years, do you think it's become a lot worse?
Yes. Short answer on that. I've been a book publisher for 35 years. This is and by the way, there's a ton of literature on this. Just Google it. You don't need me for it. It is far worse. All of my librarian friends tell me this. My educator friends tell me this. It's also, and it's interesting because, I shouldn't say it's interesting. It is also occurring in some ways because technology has shifted, right? It is occurring in some ways that some may view as more effective. So Epic, Overdrive, these are big systems that are driving ebooks, right? And the state of Wyoming wanted to take a whole bunch of our books off of the Overdrive system. Overdrive does all of the ebooks for all of the schools and libraries in I believe the whole state. And Steve had us writing, Steve Potash and the Overdrive team were incredibly, extraordinarily, brilliantly active. But I would say to you that both the political changes of our age as well as the technology changes of our age have created a far more difficult environment than any that we have seen in the last 50 years, I would say.
Yeah, I don't know how, that question interests me if it's better or worse, because when I was,
I'm sorry, we have someone who hasn't asked a question yet.
I'm sorry. I
Yeah,
apologize.
so that's fine. He's behind you. So,
Sorry, I
or
just
she's
want to ask
behind
a
you.
quick question. My mother here's actually been the CPS teacher for 20 years, and she quit in the past few years. And I know that they've had a lot of conversation in, just language education and cultural education from
Yep.
China specifically, as this political environment's heating up. A lot of them, there aren't that many of them in the city to begin with. They don't know what to do. So a lot of them end up just retiring or quitting and doing something else. It's a huge loss to the South Side where they've been serving Latino and Black communities for the past 20 years. And that breaks my heart to watch them having these debates in very close circles. My question is, how can we have safe spaces for educators who aren't born here, for example, but are dedicated to, be part of this without getting themselves canceled, to have these conversations? Like, I don't know where they can go, right, to have these conversations. And this felt like such a safe space where, outside our home, outside dinner tables, the first time we'll be able to talk about it in 2 years.
I love your question. I thank you for asking it. I would say that there are a lot of safe spaces being created, specifically with librarians, the American Library Association. If you go to one of the two docs that we provide, which is, you're going to see there are 25 originating signers to the Unite Against Against Book Bans. We are one of them, but the majority are actually associations, and they're associations of Latina librarians and very specific groups of people. Go find those people, because